Hello and welcome to this week's episode. I'm so excited for you to hear this conversation with Frank Rose. Frank is the author of The Sea We Swim In and The Art of Immersion, a landmark book on tech and narrative. He is a former contributing editor at Wired and contributing writer at Fortune. He now teaches global business executives as faculty director of Columbia University's Strategic Storytelling Seminar. He also heads the Digital Dozen Awards program at Columbia's pioneering digital storytelling lab. Today, we're talking about his brand new book, The Sea We Swim In. And in our conversation, we're going everywhere, talking about brands, storytelling, and the power of having a strong story to attract your ideal customer and create raving fans. I can't wait for you to listen in.
Okay, so I'm here with Frank Rose. Hello, Frank. I'm so happy to have you in this conversation today. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, Victoria. Great to be here. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm so excited to dig into the book. I have tons of questions. So The Sea We Swim In. Let's go ahead and get started. Share a little bit about your background and what got you so interested in stories, why you became so interested in stories in the first place.
Sure. Well, the book is really about, what I call narrative thinking, which I think is increasingly important because we're in an age where we no longer are expected to sit back and consume movies and TV shows and advertisements and things like that. We're all storytellers ourselves. And of course, in fact, we always were, but that was not really the dominant idea. That, we were expected, as I say, just to sit back. And that's no longer the case. So I feel like we all have to understand what stories are about and how they work and how we can make them work for us. For me, this really began, in two stages, perhaps. First off, most of my career, I was a journalist. I was a reporter, a magazine writer. I wrote for Wired magazine, before that for Fortune and for Esquire, and starting out with the Village Voice in Manhattan. And so I sort of had a natural, predilection, I suppose you could say, for stories. But then something happened which basically changed my life and sent me off in a new direction, which is where I am now. I teach an executive education program called Strategic Storytelling at Columbia. And what happened was, at Wired, I was a reporter sort of at the intersection of media and technology. And that literally meant anywhere from Hollywood to cell phones. I wrote about movies, I wrote about iMode, the Japanese, sort of very, at the time, avant-garde, this is 20 years ago, online internet for mobile phones. And at a certain point, I realized that the way people were telling stories was changing. And it seemed to be changing in response to technology. And what I started to realize was, as I looked into this more and more, that the way people tell stories always changes in response to technology, and that generally it takes people at least 20 or 30 or 40 years to figure out what the new technology is all about, how it works, and how to tell stories in a way that's native to that technology. The best example of this, I think, maybe the motion picture camera. Before the motion picture camera was invented, it was impossible to even conceive of things that we now take for granted, like cuts and pans and fades and all this stuff that's now part of the grammar of cinema. So when the motion picture camera came along, the very first movies, most of them were 10 minutes long, which was the length of a reel of film.
Well, I want to double click on this idea of how stories change, technology changes. Like,
right.
What does that practically mean, the how stories are executed from a book, say, to the digital world?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So what I realized as I looked into this was that every time we have a new communications technology, stories change, the way we tell stories change. Um, and basically what happens is it takes us 20, 30, 40 years to figure out what's going on with this new technology and to develop a form of storytelling that's native to it. A perfect example, I think, is with movies. The motion picture camera was invented around 1890. It was well into the 19 teens before we regularly had feature-length films with movie stars as opposed to anonymous actors that used everything that we now take for granted as part of the grammar of cinema, like cuts, pans, fades, and so forth. Because before we had a motion picture camera, it was impossible even to conceive of such a thing. So that's what's happening now, I think, in response to the internet and digital technology in general.
So would you say that we still have quite a long way to go in developing our storytelling ability on digital, on social, for example, knowing that social is only like, what, about 50 or less, really 10 years old being used for brands?
Yeah. No, it's a very good question. I do think we have a long way to go with digital technology in general, with social media in particular. Social media started out, roughly 15 years ago, and at first it seemed like, a great boon. There was a panel that a discussion that I saw several years ago, back in the late aughts, I suppose, in which one of the panelists had this great line. He said, the problem with mass media is it's not social. And what's happened since then, I think to the surprise of a lot of people, including myself, is that mass media has become much more social, and social media has become completely antisocial. And that is sort of where we find ourselves right now. And frankly, I don't have the answer for this, and I don't think anybody does, but we definitely have to sort of stumble through it and figure out, how to have a form of social media that is not toxic, which I have to say, I think Facebook is now, and others to a lesser extent, but Facebook in particular.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, let's shift a little bit, talk about sort of why the stories in general are so important. And I want you to touch on something that you have in the first section of the book about kind of homogenizing thought. So let's start there a little bit from that frame of why stories are so important for communication.
Sure. So the thing about stories is they really define our understanding of the world. We use them constantly without even thinking about it. And my thinking on this was very much influenced by Jerome Bruner, who is, of course, one of the leading psychologists of the 20th century, a leader in the revolt against behaviorism in the 1950s, and a key figure in what became known as the cognitive revolution, the evolution of cognitive science, including cognitive psychology and neuroscience. And Bruner's point, which he started developing in the 1980s, Bruner's point was that that stories are a mode of thought, a separate mode of thought. They're different from what scientists had always considered worth studying, which is to say reason and logic. And they constitute a different mode of thought from reason and logic, and one that is just as important, if not more so. Frankly, I think that reason and logic, unfortunately, are sort of an aspirational goal for us. I think that stories are much more how we think naturally, and the reason for that is that stories appeal to the emotions. Stories are emotional by nature, and so our our sense of how things work, of how of what reality even is really kind of rooted in the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell each other and the stories that we read and watch and so forth. Everything comes together through a series of stories that we, sort of interpret in our heads, and this becomes our sense of reality. That was really Bruner's point, and I think it's a really key one.
Why do you think, and I loved how you talked about this in the book as well, sort of the power of emotion, the power of story over reason. And you go into great detail, sort of giving examples throughout history and sort of bringing it forward to sort of disinformation that we're experiencing recently. But why do you think people tend to believe their stories or act in context to stories that they believe rather than scientific evidence or other kind of reason? Like, why do we do that?
Yeah, right, exactly. It's really a critical question, and I think a big part of the reason why stories are so powerful is that stories give us something, a memory hook, basically. Stories give us something to, sort of lodge in the brain and make it easy to recall. And that's really where emotion comes in as well. And I think a perfect example is the current, you can't even call it a debate, the current sense of total confusion over vaccines. It's in particular, of course, the coronavirus vaccine. There's no shortage of information that the vaccines certainly appear to be safe, certainly much safer than not being vaccinated, and that they're very effective. But it's the stories that circulate, in particular, that circulate online and in social media, that people seize on. So if you're in any way predisposed to not want the vaccine, there's no end of stories that you can cite, most of them totally bogus, that will reinforce your point of view. And, I see this in all kinds of people. It's, I recently came across a Twitter feed by a neuroscientist I'm familiar with who was talking about, freedom to, not get the vaccine, which to me is just ludicrous.
Yeah, no, and the interesting examples from the book, of particular on this topic, is just the disinformation and dangerous information that's been spread across the internet on, certain remedies that actually caused great harm to people, right? And it's funny how, that's just one example, but I believe there's a lot of ways in which we, our actions are based less on logic, more on the emotion. And a very good example is probably Starbucks, right? It's sort of like, you want a cup of coffee. I don't go to Starbucks for the coffee. I go for the feeling that I get, right? When I'm in there and the way I'm treated. And I love that. Actually points to the section you chat about the audience, the customers as the audience. So let's get to that in a minute. But I kind of want to go into, this segues perfectly. A little bit about how experiences, right? We can actually talk on that. How customers are your audience, right, for your brand. And how does experience in general correlate or strengthen the stories that we tell in our lives or for the brands that we create?
Sure. This is a really key point. And the work on this was really first done by a couple of guys, Joe Pine and James Gilmore, who in, I think it was 1998, published this book called The Experience Economy. And their point, which I reiterate in The Sea We Swim In, their point was that, we've moved obviously from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, and the next stage is moving from a service economy to an experience economy in which, basically all the world's a stage. We're all on stage all the time. Whether we're a barista at Starbucks, whether we're part of the audience at Starbucks, whether we're at a bank, whether we're, in any kind of public setting, we are going through an experience. And that, of course, was always the case, but it wasn't where the emphasis was. It wasn't something that we really thought about. And now it is something that we really have to think about. And stories fit in there, of course, at a certain level, because, stage, theater, it's all about stories, right? And when you, to take the Starbucks example, when you have a barista who is making a very specific kind of coffee for you, or the kind of drink, and there's a certain technique, and you watch this and so forth. And frankly, this has been taken much farther by other brands like Phil's in San Francisco, and so forth. But Starbucks was certainly a pioneer in this regard, and that's why they charge so much for their coffee. The other thing about Starbucks, of course, is that, which I love, is that it's an informal gathering place for people who don't even know each other, but we like being in one another's company. We can make coffee at home, we can work on our laptop and get Wi-Fi at home, but somehow we find it better to congregate in a place like Starbucks and be alone together.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the intimacy that sort of audience plays when we're telling our stories. And I love the excerpt that you included about audience versus eyeballs. So why did you feel like this was important to include in the book?
It was funny. I'm sure you noticed that takes the form of a little box that's in the book, and it was something that I did feel was important to say. It didn't exactly fit in with anything else I was saying, but so there was. I didn't feel like there was a place to kind of work it in to the overall narrative of the book, but I do think it's critical. It's always bothered me. And, even when at times in the past when I used to do it myself. And I think it's dehumanizing, and it gets to, I think, a larger issue, which is how we conceive of other people, and how we conceive in particular of the people that we, think of as our audience. And, it's easier to think of them if we just sort of dehumanize them and think of them as units, and not as like actual individuals that we have to appeal to in some emotional way. And so that was sort of the impetus, I guess you could say, for that little comment. But I did feel that it was, symptomatic of a larger thing that we do, which is to try to distance ourselves from other people, which is to try to, make ourselves a little less vulnerable, perhaps. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that eyeballs are not really where it's at, right? All the thinking, all the seeing, literally, takes place in the brain, at some considerable remove from the eyeballs. And so the sense of eyeballs is just, it's a very surface thing, because the eyeball is just like, it's an organ at the surface of the body that responds to light. Everything else takes place in the brain. And so if you're only thinking about eyeballs, you're only thinking about what's really on the surface.
And that connects to this idea of the data. Really, sort of the eyeballs to me were synonymous with this idea of like, here's the data. But in the example that you showcase on the Warby Parker and the bus, the cross-country bus, there's a beautiful paragraph where you kind of highlight how the data, how having the experiential part of the brand brings the data to life, right? You're kind of matching the hardware with the software kind of, and really, because data can only tell you so much, tell you action, right? Tell you the views. But when your brand has an experiential part to it, where you can actually be physically talking to your actual real audience, I think it's really important for brands in general not to lose the importance of that, right? There's so many different types of mechanisms by which we can track people's behaviors and gather that data. But I think the actual human touch is something that is a big differentiator between the breakout brands that you highlight in the book, right? So let's talk about kind of a segue into why storytelling is so important for brands.
Right. I think storytelling is important for brands because I think storytelling is important for brands because that's how you establish who you are. That's how you establish your identity. As I said earlier, stories are just something that people respond to naturally. There's a sense of curiosity that we have. If there's a brand that we're in some way attracted to or curious about, we want to know more about it. And again, it gets back to this idea of eyeballs, right? We want to know about the people who are behind the brand. We want to know who they are, what their goals and ambitions are, why they're doing this. Simon Sinek, wrote a best-selling book called Start With Why. If you can explain to people why you're doing something, why you want their attention, why you want their, why you want to sell them your product, it really gives us something to connect with. And it's always better to connect with something real, something that feels authentic, something that that we can make a direct human connection with, than it is to just sort of like buy a product. That's that worked a while ago, but it doesn't work so much anymore. It's one of a number of things that don't work so well anymore. And I think storytelling and stories are really at the heart of all of these things.
And it sort of goes into this idea of, how to sell, right? If we look at persuading our prospects or potential clients, right? Using the power of persuasion or highlighting the unique selling points of a product. As we discussed earlier about like rationale, right? Reasoning versus emotion, that customers are going to buy probably more easily if they connect to a story rather than being persuaded by unique selling points. Do we have, or have you seen the evidence of how that translates into the success of a brand or a company saying, you can't just muscle your way anymore into getting sales? It's more that if you don't have that emotional connection, that you're not going to be as successful. Can we say that?
Yes, I think that's definitely the case. The whole idea of the unique selling proposition, of course, started in the late 1950s with Rosser Reeves, the head of Ted Bates' advertising agency at the time, who wrote a book called Reality in Advertising, in which he argued that if you don't have a unique selling proposition, you might as well forget about it. Unique selling proposition meaning something about your product that makes it unique that will make people want to buy it. This was discarded back in the 60s with the advent of the creative revolution, so-called, in advertising. And it's even less relevant today, but it's something that people, hang on to constantly. The problem with trying to persuade people to buy your product by touting its benefits is, it just doesn't work. When you try to make an argument, people's natural response is to say, oh yeah, is that really true? Whereas when you tell a story, people are inclined just naturally to accept the basic propositions, at least, of the story, and to ultimately perhaps accept the message of the story. So there's there's something there that I think is really critical. Again, it has to do with emotions. It has to do with the emotional content and quality of storytelling. And a very good example is there was a ad for Volkswagen that was done in, I think, around 2011 or so in the Super Bowl. And there's a company based in London called Real Eyes, that looks at this sort of thing. And what they found was that, well, they compared it to another ad that ran at the same time for a Ford Compact that focused on fuel economy. The fuel economy ad, it was pretty dreary, I have to admit, but it got almost no traction on social media. It got almost no clicks on YouTube, whereas the Volkswagen ad, it was an ad for the Passat, got a tremendous response and a tremendous number of shares. And the Volkswagen ad, you didn't even know it was about Volkswagen until the last, maybe 5 or 6 seconds. The whole thing was about a little boy, maybe 7 years old or so, who's dressed up in a Darth Vader costume. You can't even see his face. And he goes around the house trying to animate everything using the force. Not even the dog will wake up. And so he's completely frustrated. And finally, his dad drives up in the driveway with his new VW Passat, and the kid stands in front of it while the dad goes into the house, and he does his thing, trying to animate it with the force. And to his shock, the VW turns on. Right? It actually comes on. Cut to inside the house in the kitchen. The dad is standing at the kitchen window looking at the driveway and clicking the remote. So that's the kind of emotional hook that a story can give. And frankly, another reason that stories are so important now in brand marketing is that we can get all the information we want about any product in the world online. We don't need to be told, by a suspect source, what the advantages of it are. We can find out for ourselves, and we can get, 1 million product reviews from users and consumers and so forth. And that's going to be much more convincing to us than anybody telling you how great their product is.
Well, Frank, that was such an aha moment for me. You're absolutely right? It's that everyone does that extensive research, and there's bloggers that will do millions. You can find millions of reviews on anything. So it's our job as marketers or as founders and to make our company brand have that emotional connection and let the sort of results speak for itself almost, right? The reviewers and the raving fans kind of speak for themselves. So let's talk a little bit about this story a little bit deeper. So a lot of times the stories become the unique selling point at some junction, right? And so a lot of entrepreneurs I see in recent years, right, they use their own personal story, like their own personal personality as the vehicle to make connection for the brand. The problem is that, as your business grows, the process of extracting yourself from the brand story, the brand personality becomes kind of like a pickle, right? So I wonder what your advice would be. Do you believe that it's better to sort of start with building the brand sort of separate from the personality of the founder from the beginning? Or do you think that there is an elegant way to sort of transition it?
I think it can be transitioned, and I think even for a brand that becomes big, there's still a lot to be said for making a connection to the founders. That's just a natural story in itself, and it gives people, not just something to connect with, but somebody to connect with. And we all love to connect with other people. That's what it's all about. That's what life is about. And so, I don't really feel any conflict there at all. It obviously, somebody who is the head of a multi-billion-dollar corporation operates at a different scale, entirely different scale from somebody who has a startup. But look at Steve Jobs. This is somebody who was key to the identity of Apple from the very start. When they got rid of him in the 1980s, the company slowly and then very quickly started going to hell in a handbasket. And then he came back in and turned it, with the help, of course, of a lot of people there, but basically using his ideas and his personality into the most valuable publicly traded company in the world today, which is what it is. And that was, his personality and the force of his, will became a really key point, I think, in creating that. Apple itself had a personality. There were other things going on there, like the fact that they didn't, tout all their advantages when they came out with the iPod. They didn't tell you, how much memory it had or anything like that. They just showed pictures of you having fun with it, and that's what it's all about. But Steve Jobs and his, the introductions that he did on stage, all of that became just a really key part of Apple's identity, and I think a key part of its success.
And so for founders that are building now that feel like they don't want to be sort of like the star, right? They don't like that kind of spotlight. How do you believe they can practically craft stories that are going to have that emotional connection that's not about their personal lives? So I'm thinking about some of the Warby Parker examples. Like, is it necessary to be, having a detailed background story for every single part of your logo and your color? Does that sort of help bridge that gap between making the emotional connection for the brand as a standalone rather than just a figurehead?
Right. That's a very good question, and I think it can. I think Warby Parker is actually a great example. The founders of Warby Parker have been written up countless times in magazines like Fast Company and Inc., but they're not all that well known to the general public, and that has to be by design. So, they managed to sort of get across the quirkiness and the advantages of the brand. That all becomes part of the brand story. We know sort of intuitively, if nothing else, that it's a sort of a renegade brand. It came about by it's sort of a renegade brand that came about because somebody did not have the wherewithal to buy. Somebody did not have the wherewithal to replace his $700 pair of Prada sunglasses with that broke or that he lost with something new. But we don't really need to know who that person was or why any of this happened. What we need to know is that it's a brand that represents something, that stands for something, that has that makes a direct connection with its customers. I think that's what's most important here.
Do you have some advice on? So we talked about experience, right? And a lot of the visuals or the physicality of a brand can really produce that emotion, that experiential emotion for clients, for customers. But can you talk a little bit about the importance of the voice of the brand?
Yeah, I think that's really key. voice is something that as a writer, you always have to come to grips with. And what it really means is understanding who you are and understanding how you naturally express yourself and how that works, and it becomes an issue of authenticity and of not trying to be someone you're not. And this works for individuals. It's works most obviously for individual writers. It's something I had to come to terms with very early in my career as a journalist, but it's not just writers, it's everybody. And certainly it applies to brands. So just as a individual has a certain type of voice that they naturally communicate with, and by voice, I mean is it humorous? Are they funny? Are they serious? Are they always trying to make a point? What is their personality and how does it come through? This applies to a brand just as much as it applies to an individual person.
And any kind of ideas on, and maybe you can leverage from your own experience as a writer, but how, especially as startups start bringing on other people to execute the voice, any tips or advice on how to maintain brand consistency, right? Because it's so important, and it's something I think often very difficult from the operational standpoint to sort of do, right?
Right. Yeah, it is. And, especially as a company gets bigger, when you're a startup, it's, if you know who you are, then it's relatively easy to get that across, and certainly to get across consistently. As you hire more and more people, obviously the easy thing to say is, hire people who are like you, but that's that's very hard to do, and it's very hard to know who it is you're hiring until you've actually hired them. So failing that, I think the best thing to do is to somehow kind of codify, but not too rigidly. Try to codify, who you are and what your voice is, and by you I mean your brand, and just put it down so that people, the people who work for you, people who work with you, the people who speak for you, know what they're supposed to be doing, and and it doesn't just sort of go off in some random direction that which is very much not what you want to do.
Yeah. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the evolution of the brand, how to amplify the brand. So talking a little bit about the platform and the immersion aspect of brands. So obviously there's examples of this. We talked about Starbucks a little bit, Disney you touch on, but how are stories sort of manufactured across platforms to create these kind of different experiences around one narrative? I would love to tie that into sort of, that's like a big scale, right? Multinationals, how they do it. They've got, parks or various TV shows and things like that. But I see a big connection on how the average person can kind of do that either for themselves individually across various social platforms or for their brand. So talk a little bit about sort of how the big guys do it, right? And how maybe you see smaller brands or smaller operations pulling it off on like a smaller scale.
Sure. No, that's a really interesting question. I feel that, I mean, for me, it comes down to the idea of a narrative platform. You want to create a narrative platform for yourself or for your brand. And what that really means is it ties into the idea that who we are, our identity in the eyes of other people, is really kind of the sum of all the stories that we tell about ourselves and about everything else. And that's true of individuals, it's certainly true of brands. And so what you need to do as a big brand, as say a company like Walt Disney, is to understand that everything ties in to your identity. Everything that you say, everything that you do is part of who you are in the eyes of your customers, your users, your audience, the general public. And so Walt Disney himself conveyed this in a brilliant fashion in a drawing that was done that he did in 1957, a sort of schematic that resurfaced about 8 or 10 years ago, the Harvard Business Review article. And what it did was it showed how all the different parts of the Walt Disney Studio worked together. There was a theatrical division, there was television, there was music, there was books, there was comics, and there was, of course. And really, at the center of this was the theatrical division, the motion pictures. And then radiating off from that, but all connected to one another in one way or another, were all of these, sort of ancillary divisions, like television and Disneyland and music and so forth. And they all work together. And in the same way, a series of stories that a big brand can tell works together. The main example I use in the book is The Walking Dead, which, as you probably know, was at one time the most popular, television show on any platform. The first time that a cable TV show overtook, what was on the original 3 broadcast networks. So what they did with The Walking Dead was, of course, it was based on a comic series. They created the television series based on that. And then they created all this other stuff around it. They did webisodes. They did a spin-off TV show. They even did a TV show, a TV talk show about the show itself, which I thought was just brilliant. So after every, episode of The Walking Dead, there was a half-hour talk show where people discussed what was going on in that episode. And then, of course, there were games, and there were mobile games, and there was stuff like Dead Yourself, which was a mobile app that you could use to see what you would look like if you were a zombie. And this of all these things, of course, they really, played on our fascination with zombies and ultimately with death. And it just became a, sort of a brilliant I'm not quite sure what the term is, so let's back off from that, if you don't mind. It all became part of a brilliant series of stories that came together to connect with the TV show, to connect people with the TV show. The more of a fan you were, the more of all this stuff you were going to be, caught in the web of. But and what that meant was that you were going to become more and more of a, proselytizer for the show. And in the case of Walking Dead, there was even a talk about experiential. There was even there were things that happened in the real world that connected with the show. Like, for example, you could go down to Atlanta where it was filmed, and you could be, you could go to a zombie school, and you could, become a walker on the show, an extra basically. And people love to do this, even though it was, hot and horrendously uncomfortable and so forth. It just, people couldn't wait. So, there's just a million ways to, that you can engage people in your story. And, my introduction to this idea, and really the thing that set me on this whole course, I suppose you could say, certainly set me on writing my earlier book, The Art of Immersion, was an interview that I did with James Cameron in 2006. I was doing a story for Wired magazine on 3D. And of course, Cameron had invented this 3D camera system. And I at the time, it was sort of widely expected that the next movie he was going to do was Avatar. It was been in development and pre-production for years and years, and so everybody thought this was going to be the next thing. So of course I asked him about it, and what he said was he didn't really want to talk about it very much, right? So, but he did say this. He said that for him, he described it as sort of an Edgar Rice Burroughs style action adventure film that takes place on another planet. Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, being the author of Tarzan. What he said beyond that was that for him, the best way to tell a story like that was to really create a sort of a fractal experience where if you were a casual fan, you could just sort of watch the movie and that would be fine. You would be satisfied. But if you were a more committed fan, you could go deeper and deeper into the story, and the pattern would still hold. And so that's what The Walking Dead, did with their show. That's what AMC did with their show. They created this whole network of stories that surrounded, the main story, the main TV show, and people could go deeper and deeper into it. And for a story, for a TV show that was just on, maybe 16 times a year, you need to create something. You need to create something that people will hang on to, some reason for them to think about it after they've watched all the episodes that have just come out. So that was really that was really AMC's solution. And it was really, I don't know if it was intentionally or not, but it was certainly building on what James Cameron said. And this is just as important for small brands, for startups, as it is for anybody else. We can all surround ourselves, and we all do, in fact, with stories. We can do it online and social media, on YouTube or Vimeo. We can sort of create an ecosystem of stories that explains who we are and how it all fits together. And that's what I mean by narrative platform. And I think it's just as important, maybe even more important, for a small company or a startup than for a big outfit.
Then let's talk a little bit about, because there's a difference, and you definitely talk about this, but I feel it. I think we all do. The difference between being immersed in something, immersion, and just engagement, right? So as marketers or as business owners, we're so focused on the engagement, right? How many people are engaged with social posts or watching videos, right? But what is the marked difference between immersion and engagement?
That's a very good point. I think that engagement is, engagement is important, but it's easy to get misled by that, and it's easy to, kind of lose your focus. Ultimately, it doesn't matter that much. What really matters is how immersed people are in your story or your stories or your product, and the stories around it. And immersion is really a function of caring, of wanting to know more, of being a fan. And companies like Apple and Warby Parker have fans. They don't just have customers. And with Warby Parker, it was, this was the case at the very beginning, when they were just first starting out. People became fans of what they were doing because it was new and different, because at the time, in particular, this was, I believe, 2010 or so, the idea of selling something direct to consumers was still quite new, and had only, recently been made possible by internet connections. And so, really the whole idea that of communicating who you are, I think that's what is so critical here.
And the layers. I mean, what stuck out to me, what you just said on the James Cameron thing, was about the pattern that will still hold. I think that's really, really critical, right? Because, I look at things like, and I fell headfirst into Walking Dead, definitely. Another experience I've had, Avatar evoked that, but something like The Lord of the Rings, something that is it's the world, right, that kind of pulls you in. And I think there's something really interesting about the holding of the pattern, right? That as you dig deeper, there's that consistency, right? Not that you're always doing the same thing or telling the same kind of stories, but there's, and this is why I think how we relate it to brands, right? If the brand pillars or the brand values or whatever it is, that the stories, that the layers, that pattern is always around some core structure, right? So people feel safe or that they feel like they understand. But I think that what you're speaking on the version of the immersion and engagement is a lot about the depth, right? It's the depth that you go through in showcasing the story or growing the story, the core story or the core narrative. So that's pretty cool. Let's talk about, I want to talk about how storytelling can sort of fix problems in the world. So sort of shift gears a little bit, right? Psychologically, we know that a lot is happening inside us when we hear stories, right? And emotional connections can prompt our actions, right? It actually informs our actions. So how can we use stories to change narratives or to persuade? And is there sort of an argument for or against, and this maybe is a separate question, but I really want to dig into the idea of representation, right? Representation mattering in stories. Because from what I've gathered, obviously that can change your feelings towards a person or a group of people by having that emotional connection through story. So how can we fix the world's problem through stories? I guess that's the question.
Well, I think really the key to all of this is the idea of how we understand stories, how we process stories. And there's been a lot of neuroscience and cognitive psychology work in this in the last 10, 15 years, maybe as much as 20. Much of it in response to the sort of thing that Jerome Bruner set in motion about how we need to understand how stories work. And the general consensus, I think, is that we understand stories by imaginatively projecting ourselves into them. There are a number of experiments that show this, how this happens and so forth. But all you really have to do is think about going to a horror movie just like, of course, that's how it works. Why else would you get scared? You're just sitting there in a dark, movie theater, and nothing's, probably going to happen to you. So nonetheless, we get scared out of our wits. And it really has to do with the idea that we project ourselves into stories. We do this, it's an imaginative process. And we sort of lose track of who and where we are. And the more immersed we are, the more that happens, right? And so it really becomes, I think, a critical issue to think about creating a world in which the story takes place. It's not just, telling a story, it's telling a story that can be sort of open-ended, perhaps, and that certainly has room for people to imagine themselves in it. And to project themselves into it. And we find there's a number of quite interesting experiments that I go into in the book and also in my Columbia program. We find that people are more likely to project themselves into the story imaginatively if they can identify with the main character. And, if the main character somehow resembles them. But we also find that, for example, if we are not told something about the main character that would make him or her different, like perhaps that they're gay or, for a white audience that they're Black, if they're not told this right away, we will tend to bond with the character anyway. And then when it becomes, when we do learn this information, it's too late. It doesn't matter to us anymore because we've already formed a connection with this character. And so I think that's a really key thing to keep in mind. You need to have characters who are sympathetic, sympathetic to your main. You need to have characters who are sympathetic to your main audience that they can identify with.
Yeah, I think that was such an interesting study that you cited in the book about people's impressions or level of empathy that they feel towards the characters with those marked difference that you mentioned, just based on where that fact was cited, right, in a book, or how laid into it, right? Is because the audience had time to make that connection, which is really cool. Let's talk a little bit about, this is more of a personal curiosity, because you're at Columbia, you're with the Gen Zers and the young folk nowadays. And I've read several Harvard Business Review articles and getting the impression, just the increasing importance that brands take a stand on social issues, and sort of building the brand story around that. Do you find that that's getting more important, or that's something that's going to be like a part of the decision-making process for the younger generations for their purchasing decisions? Or you think that it's just kind of like, maybe seems like that way on the surface and it's not really what the reality is?
No, I think it is important, and I think it forms a real problem for brands that are trying to be all things to all people. A brand like Warby Parker is not going to appeal to everyone. It's basically becomes a kind of a lifestyle brand, and that means it appeals to people who have a certain kind of lifestyle. And there are many, many brands like this. I mean, Starbucks is a very good example. You can still have a huge, audience, a huge customer base, but they identify with each other, and they can be identified psychographically. And this is, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind. Now, the problem, of course, with taking a stand on issues is that not all the public takes the same stand on the same issues, right? I mean, this is obvious. And so for a truly mass brand, it becomes a lot easier to kind of, duck the question if at all possible. But I think that leads to a kind of cynicism that is going to be obvious to people and going to be obvious to your audience. So I don't think ultimately, any brand is going to be able to, duck important questions. And again, this is something that comes up with the coronavirus. It's been politicized in the US and in other countries as well, to a sort of ridiculous extent. But, you see companies like, American Airlines or United taking a real stand on this. We believe in customer safety and employee safety, and we're not going to let you on, and certainly not going to let our employees on if they're not vaccinated, because this is, all of the stories to the contrary notwithstanding, science shows that this is what will prevent the disease from spreading.
Yeah. So let's, I've got one more critical question for you to wrap up, but it's talking a little bit about what the future holds for stories and brands.
Yeah, well, that is a huge question, and I don't think anybody knows, including myself, because the reason for that is because the technology is, it's not like, suddenly we went digital and everything changed. It's still rocketing ahead. And we don't really know where exactly it's going. A few years ago, it looked as if virtual reality would be, a huge part of storytelling. And, now not so much. I think that, there's still perhaps a role for it, but there are a number of problems that have to be addressed with virtual reality before it will become that important to us, certainly as a storytelling medium. I think there are certain things that are, certainly coming to the fore. One of them is the idea that we don't often we don't just want to be told a story. We want to experience the story, which means that we have to have some form of control over it ourselves as the audience. Another key thing that's come out of psychology and neuroscience research in recent years is that we don't just consume a story, whether it's something we read or a TV show or a movie or whatever. We co-create it in our minds. We co-create it in partnership, ultimately with the author. And what that means is that, again, it's the whole idea of projecting yourself into the story. We interpret the story in light of, and unconsciously, but in light of our own experiences and our predilections and our sense of the world, our understanding of the world. And so this sense of co-creation becomes key. And, co-creation becomes important when we're in a story that, there are certain stories that, in certain media, and VR is certainly one of them, in which it's easy to kind of shade over from stories to games and vice versa. In games, as I discussed in The Art of Immersion, my earlier book, games are really about we watch something happening or we experience it ourselves, and we come away from it with our own story to tell. This is the case if you watch a baseball game. It's the case of watching people play video games online. Twitch has become huge because of this whole thing. And just the idea that that we become the storyteller itself is, I think, revolutionizing stories in a way that we're only beginning to understand. At the same time, that's not the only way we want to experience stories. We want to experience other types of stories, and a show like Game of Thrones, for example, is a perfect. A television show like Game of Thrones is a perfect example of this. We want to know where the story is going. We want to have a sense, certainly, that the storyteller knows where it's going, and that becomes the real basis for our understanding and our participation and our immersion in the story.
Mm. And so, if we wanted to give some advice on brands on how to kind of stay ahead of the curve or leverage kind of new trends that may be coming around the bend, what advice might you give to founders?
I think it really comes down to a combination of a story that you control, that you know how to tell, that you know where it's going, and a story that invites people to have their own input into it. I think, again, I would go back to The Walking Dead, the example of a mobile app like Dead Yourself, is perfect. We all would like to imagine ourselves in a story that we love or that we care about or that affects us emotionally in some way. And and so to be able to do that is really key. Another thing that comes to mind, this is not in the book, but it's something that I've been thinking about lately, and it certainly could be in the book. There's a brand of gin called The Botanist, right? And it is made on the Isle of Islay in the Hebrides in Scotland, an incredibly remote part of the world. And it's the reason it's called The Botanist is that they decided it was. Let me back up just a moment. It was created by this whiskey distillery, of course, a Scottish single malt. they wanted to have another product that they could, that they wouldn't have to age for 10 years like you do with single malt. And so they came up with this idea of a gin, and they found that there were two retired botanists living on this incredibly remote island, and that they engaged them, the botanists, to forage for these botanicals that were unique to the island. And, those went into the making of the gin. So, and then they called the gin, of course, the botanist. Yeah. And, it's a quite unique gin. And I've seen it everywhere from, literally, liquor stores in Manhattan to a bar in Hanoi. Which suggests that it really translates, right? And so using a story in that way, I think is really key. And when you go to their website, you see all kinds of stuff. You see videos, you see stories about the people who actually make it, all of that, and of course about the botanists themselves. So it's just another way of giving an identity to a brand.
I love that. You kind of sparked me to think about kind of the idea of like, yes, there's the brand story, right? That you want to have that narrative around, but there's also the story in the head of the consumer of who they want to be, right? And it's a beautiful thing when those two stories really play into each other, right? Like the person that drinks this botanist gin, the kind of person they aspire to be is someone that, has visited this small remote island perhaps, or has experienced picking these herbs and flowers that they use into the gin. So I think that is quite cool. All right, one last question though, I think is a good place to leave off in closing the discussion about the book. So The Sea We Swim In, could you just tell us a little bit about why that title?
Yes. So the title of The Sea We Swim In really came about because early on, I was, as I said, quite taken with Jerome Bruner and with his writings about stories. Oddly enough, although Bruner advocated for studying stories and understanding them and how they work and so forth, and for their importance to our lives, I'm not sure that he ever actually told the story himself, at least not in his writings. Even his autobiography is about, all the ideas that he had and championed. Mm-hmm. So in any case, that's just a minor irony. But the, one thing that he said that really struck me was, I should say, one thing that he wrote that really struck me was a short passage, which is at the very front of the book, an epigraph, in which he says, we are, like the fish who never understands. I'm getting bollocks up in this. Sorry. A short quote in which he says, basically, like the fish who never recognizes water for what it is, we swim in a sea of stories, and without really realizing it, without understanding it. And then I came across a talk that David Foster Wallace gave on the occasion of a college commencement in, I believe it was 2005, in which he told this, he started off by telling this little joke. And the joke was, with my apologies to Mr. Wallace, the joke was essentially that these two young fish swimming along, and an older fish comes the other way and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two younger fish swim along for a moment, and then one of them turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" Yeah.
And I think that's it's a beautiful place to wrap up, because I think, whether they're brand stories or the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves or how we view our lives and our work and everything that we do, it's all about the narrative that we create for ourselves. So this is such an awesome conversation. Thank you so much. The book, I adore the book. Everyone needs to go get the book, but please tell us, where can everyone find you? Where do you like to hang out online? And maybe talk a little bit about the strategic storytelling seminar, because I know that that's available to anyone, right? Not just Columbia students.
Yes, right. It's actually an executive education seminar. So it's designed for people, in fact, who are not Columbia students. Yeah. You can find out information about that and about more information about the book and everything else that I'm involved with at frankrose.com. You can also find me on Twitter at frankrose. And the Columbia program is it's co-sponsored by the School of the Arts, Columbia University School of the Arts, which is a graduate school of basically theater and dance and film and so forth, and Columbia Business School Executive Education. So there's links on frankrose.com to information on the Columbia site about the program. We run it. We're currently running it virtually 3 times a year. Before the coronavirus pandemic, we were running it in person twice a year in New York. My suspicion is that as coronavirus inevitably fades eventually, we'll continue to do the live online version, and we'll go back to doing it in person as well. There's certainly advantages to each one. But the program is really, in its live version, in its in-person version, the program is a 2-day intensive about really what stories are, how they work, how you can make them work for you. And we have people from all kinds of different outfits, from major consultancies like McKinsey and PricewaterhouseCoopers to big corporations like Google and Salesforce, AB InBev, the beverage company, and to people from nonprofits like the American Red Cross or the International Red Cross. We have people from all over the world. And we have entrepreneurs. One of my favorites was, there was a young woman from Madrid who she and her brother had started a chain of Japanese hamburger stands in Madrid. Yeah. So I just thought that was brilliant. It's a story in itself. Yeah. So, it's a huge inspiration for me to, work with people like this, to talk with them and get get a sense of what they want and need and what their own stories are.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. Everyone go get the book, The Sea We Swim In, and it was such a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Victoria. It was great. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this week. Thank you for listening to the Marketing for Startups podcast and for sticking around till the end. It would mean so much to me if you could like and subscribe to this podcast. It's a great way of telling the world that this podcast has content worth listening to. And remember, you could always reach me at LinkedIn at Victoria Hajar or at uglyventures.com. Thanks for listening. Until next week.